which is just a really interesting question on so many different levels, because one of the questions that constantly comes up in the context of recent movements, the Black Lives Matter movement and other sorts of things, is this question of, well, are Jews white people, right? Or are Jews not white people? And as with any question that involves Jews and conversations you have with Jews, right, there's going to be a variety of opinions given based on where people are coming from. Go ahead, Sid.
I think the question is, are Jews people?
Well, right, and that's and I do think that that's a really interesting addendum to that question, right? Sid's question was, are Jews people? Right? Yeah, go ahead, Mickey.
I believe that Hitler said Jews are below white people.
Not even below white people. Hitler would say, right, that Jews are less than people, right? They're not quite people, right? And it is a really interesting question, right, to ask, in what contexts and in what societies, right, are certain groups deemed as less than human, right? Or maybe to put it slightly differently, less human than other groups, right? And so it's a very, very sensitive topic, right? So I think that Sid is pointing at something really important, right? Because in a sense, those questions are the same, right? Are Jews white people is somewhat the same question as are Jews actually people, right? Because in a system like ours, right, we have been working to counteract this for decades, right? But it's recently, since the last administration, these questions have become really, really, they become real questions again for a surprising and alarming number of people, right? Are people who are not white people actually people, right? And yeah, go ahead, Sue.
There is also a recent book called Caste.
Yeah, would you grab the microphone? Yes, the recent book called Caste, exactly.
They point out that the Indians, for example, have the people who are the untouchables, which are therefore less than people.
Right.
And the Nazis looked over at the South and they said, "Oh, these people are less than people. I guess we should call the Jews less than people."
Right. So what the book Caste, which I highly recommend. Is it working?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Which I highly recommend if you have a chance. You can, and if you're no longer a reader, meaning that it's difficult for you to use your eyes to read. The Caste is available as an audiobook, which is really great. And that's how I listen. I'm not much of a reader of that type of book, sitting down and reading anymore. And so I was able to listen to that in the car, and it was really, really powerful. And what Sid is saying is true. I would just make one shift, Sid, right, is that it was not so much that, as far as I understood it, that the Nazis looked at the American South, although obviously they did. They looked at America in general, right, as a model for the Nuremberg laws, right, which defined different, and there were certain ways in which Nazism was harsher than American race law, and in some ways it was actually not as harsh as American race law, which was really fascinating for me. I myself had not encountered those parallels before, and so it was really a very, very, very powerful. But right, I think what this article sort of suggests, right, which I think is very important, right, is that every caste system, every system of race, right, is going to be culturally specific, right, and so the cultural categories of Black people versus white people, right, doesn't exist in the same way in Germany, I don't think, as it does here. I don't know, but I think African Americans, when they were in Europe during the First World War, right, noticed that there was a big difference between the way European white people treated them and the way American white people treated them. And so it was,
In France.
yeah, especially in France, exactly. And so, and that was also mentioned in this book, Caste. There was a whole chapter about that. So that the American idea of race, right, is specific to America, right? But the general category of race and racism, right, is not limited to America. It's just that the way it's constructed is going to be different in different places. And so if people were here a couple of weeks ago, we looked at that. We looked at the Kimberly Crenshaw, right, who made a very helpful statement. She said, race is a fiction, right? And then she put a quizzical look on her face and said, but racism is real, right? What do we do with that, right? And so right, distinctions between people based on whatever kind of characteristic we want to say, right, tend to be fictional, right? But the systems that develop to put certain classes or castes in their place, right, those are very real. All right, so let's look at this article. Yeah, go ahead, Sid.
It also goes down to the color of the skin, where the very dark and the lighter and the lighter and the lighter all have different levels of acceptance.
Right, and that leads, of course, to what's known, I think, as colorism, right, where even people who are in the what's the word I'm looking for? The disfavored caste, right, are able to sort of make gradations among themselves, right? So, in certain places, right, in India, I guess this is also the case, lighter skin is more valued and darker skin is less valued.
Oh, that's South Africa as well.
And South Africa, right. And so again, South Africa has its own sort of system, right? And if you haven't listened to or read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, I strongly recommend it. One of the things he says there, which I also love, which is that he says racism is stupid, right? Not stupid in the sense of it's a dumb thing to do, right? But racism as a practice is stupid because it paints itself into corners, right? So that there were, and I forget now the specifics because it was long enough ago that I listened to the book, but he said that in the South African system, right, people of Japanese descent were in one caste and people of Chinese descent were in a different caste, right? Now, most South Africans wouldn't be able to tell them apart necessarily, right? But if it said Japanese, right, you were, say for the sake of argument, you were colored, and if you were Chinese, you were black, right? Doesn't make any sense, right? So that was sort of Trevor Noah's example about how racism is stupid. All right. So let's read this one and we'll see how we see it.
I've got a question.
Oh, sure.
Well, I just want.
Oh, sure.
Because I don't know, I'm not that historically well read about it, but this color caste
Yeah.
in India and South Africa and so forth, was this centuries old or did this come about in the last century?
Okay, well.
You know what I mean?
Right,
Were
right.
were they influenced by the US?
Right. So I am no expert in these
Yeah.
things. I've read this one book, Caste, and I read, so I don't want to steer you wrong. So so with that caveat, I'll tell you what I understand.
Yeah.
And if people have different understandings, please correct me. I understand that the caste system in India is centuries old,
Right.
but in South Africa, right, it was a 20th century thing in the United States, right? This date that keeps them coming up, right? 1619, right? So it's about 400 years old in North America, right? And so, and to what degree they are, I mean, the question that I have about that book, Caste, right, is to what degree right? Is this something where cultures are explicitly looking to other cultures in the way that Nazi Germany looked at our country, for examples, and constructing these things? And to what degree is this something that human societies have a tendency to do, right? And we as humans grab onto sort of superficial distinctions, right, in order to make sense of the world in a way that is going to work for the people who are powerful and undermine the people that are not powerful. I think what's really interesting about caste, though, is that it's pretty clear. It was pretty clear to me before I read this book, Caste, and it's even clearer to me now that the people in the upper class castes are just as trapped as the people in the lower castes, right? It doesn't do anybody any favors, right? Yeah, you want to say something, maybe?
That stress is easier to bear when you have privilege.
100%, 100%. And, right, if you are in the, if you are in the favored caste, but you don't have a tremendous amount of privilege, right, then you can find yourself stuck in the middle, right? So the example in this country was public swimming pools. When desegregation was court ordered, right, many towns preferred to cement their swimming pools rather than have, God forbid, Black people and white people swimming in the same pool, right? Rich white people were able to join private clubs or to build their own swimming pools in their backyards, right? White people who were of the upper, in the higher caste and previously were able to swim in those swimming pools, right? Who didn't have the means to join private clubs or to build their own swimming pools, they were left out, right? So it creates a lot of resentment. Yeah.
There was a section in the book Work where this woman was allowing her worker, her African-American worker in the South, to use her bathroom, and she had to build a bathroom outside the house so that she wouldn't have to use the bathroom because of pressure from the people.
Right. Exactly. It's the way, and so caste is sort of a supra-personal experience. People will enforce caste without even really knowing that that's what they're doing. Right. So being aware of it is very helpful. All right, so the racial distinctions between master and slave may be more familiar to Americans, but they were and are no more real than those between Gentile and Jew. All right, it made sense to the New York Daily News sports editor that these guys dominated basketball. And this is in the same way that the Jews were the boxers, right, for a while. Right. After all, the game places a premium on alert, scheming mind, and flashy trickiness, right? Artful dodging and general smart aleckness, not to mention their God-given better balance and speed. And whom are we talking about? The Jews. Right. This is like every kid, in the 80s and the 90s, like, oh, there's a Jewish basketball player. Oh, there's a Jewish baseball, it's like, it's so exciting. Right. In the 1930s, Paul Gallico was trying to explain away Jewish dominance of basketball. He came up with the idea that the game structure simply appealed to the immutable traits of wily Hebrews and their scheming minds. It sounds strange to the ear now, but only because our stereotypes about who is inherently good at particular sports has shifted. His theory is not any more or less insightful now than it was then. His confidence should remind us to be skeptical of similar supposedly explanatory arguments that abound today, right? And we all hear them, right? It's inevitable that we're going to hear about this group or that group being better or worse at sports, right? And understanding, right, that these things are variables within populations. All right, looking back at old stereotypes is a useful exercise. It can help illustrate the arbitrary nature of the concept of race and how such identities shift, even as people insist on their permanence and infallibility. Right? And many of the people in this room, probably including me, have been old enough to sort of see these stereotypes shift over time. Not Jacob, probably. Yeah, okay. Because race is not real, it is malleable enough to be made to serve the needs of those with the power to define it. The certainties of one generation giving way to the contradictory dogmas of another. Whoopi Goldberg, it's not her real name, by the way, just in case you were wondering. Right? I mean, not real, it was not her given name when she was born. Right? She chose it out of some feeling of connection to Jews, actually. The actor and co-host of The View stumbled into a public relations nightmare for ABC on Monday, some weeks ago, when she insisted that the Holocaust wasn't about race. After an episode of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert aired in which she opined that the Nazis were white people and most of the people they were attacking were white people, right? That age-old and really frustrating question, are Jews white people? Right? She was temporarily suspended from The View. She has apologized for her remarks. I don't mean to
You know what? What was the last sentence?
She apologized.
Oh,
Right? She got it, right? She got it that she had misconstrued, right? That she was applying something that you might talk about, about one category and applying it to another category where that category wasn't relevant. I don't mean to pile on Goldberg here, who I think is struggling with an American conception of race that renders the anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust illegible. Right? And that's one of the things that I think is very valuable about the book Caste, right? As opposed to many other books that I've read about trying to figure out, race in America, right? Is that it's very aware of this mutability of racial categories. Isaac, you want to say something?
No.
Okay. That's fine. I just don't want to miss you. I regard her remarks not as malicious, but as an ignorant projection of that American conception onto circumstances to which it does not apply. In America, distinctions among European immigrants that were once considered deeply significant dissolved into the melting pot, right? We probably all remember, right, that there were times when Irish people were not welcome, right? And certainly Jews were not welcome, right? We've had conversations where people have shared their experiences of anti-Semitism when they were children. Or not, even when they were adults. They dissolved into the melting pot, leaving an absence in popular memory that might explain their salience elsewhere. Right? And how someone could be seen as white in America and yet still be subject to persecution based on their race. The Nazi Holocaust in Europe and slavery and Jim Crow in the United States are outgrowths of the same ideology. The belief that human beings can be delineated into categories that share immutable biological traits, distinguishing them from one another and determining their potential and behavior. In Europe, with its history of anti-Jewish persecution and violent religious divisions, the conception of Jews as a biological race with particular characteristics was used by the Nazis to justify the Holocaust. In the United States, the invention of race was used to justify the institution of chattel slavery on the basis that Black people were biologically suited to permanent servitude and unfit for the rights the nation founders had proclaimed as universal, right? So this gets to Sid's question at the very beginning, right? It's not so much, a question of, who's favored over who's not favored, right? It's really like who counts as a person, right? Who counts as an actual person the way that the founders were talking about. Go ahead, Sid.
I was wondering how many people who signed the Declaration of Independence did not have slaves. The number was negligible.
Right.
I think about 8
Right.
out of 40-some odd people.
Right. Which is an argument, right, for understanding, first of all, that for the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, right, the proclamation of universal rights for all people, right, was not cognitive dissonance that they were feeling with the idea that they also owned slaves.
Well, so in the Constitution, we have 2/3 of a person.
Right, that was a little later, right? That was not too much later, but I mean, they did come up with, they did begin to realize that this was a problem, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and if any, I see, do we still have people on? Yeah, so Florence and Mickey, if either of you want to say something, please feel free to speak up so that I know that you want to, because I can't have you on my screen right at this moment. The American color line was therefore much more forgiving to European Jews than the divisions of the old country were. But they are branches of the same tree, the biological fiction of race. In the US, physical distinctions between most Black and most white people have misled some into thinking that the American conception of race is somehow more real than the racial fictions on which the Nazis based their campaign of extermination. Go ahead, Judith. Sure.
It would seem to me that the whole thing, I lost what I was going to say. The Nazi campaign of extermination was not based on race in the sense of Black or white or something else. It basically had nothing to do with that. It was a historical, religious hatred that was instilled in Western civilization.
Yeah, it's a really, that's right. So that's a really interesting, it's a really interesting point, right? Because in Europe, right, there was a transition, I think we can say, right, from anti-Judaism, right, which is what you're talking about, religious persecution, the rejection of Judaism, and thus people who were Jews, right, were less than in all kinds of ways. But that was a religious distinction. It was not a racial distinction, which was to say, right, that if you were to convert to the proper religion, that being Christianity, right, that you could become, say, the Prime Minister of England, right? And you could hold all kinds of positions of power as long as you were the right religion, right? In the 19th century, right, while Disraeli was being the Prime Minister of England, right, scientists, we might call them now, right, which is another reason. There's always people who say, "Oh, I believe in science," right? Be careful, right? Because scientists brought us a lot of other stuff too, right? But scientists decided, right, that they were going to measure skulls and measure noses and decide, right, that particular biological traits, right, which tend to be normal variations within genetic pools, right, were actually signals of something deeper, right, something that was permanent. And so even if a person were to convert, right, it was their race, it was their biological, it was a biological reality that they were Jewish, and that Jewishness could not be expunged by professing a different belief, right? And so that what we call scientific racism or scientific anti-Semitism, that's what the Nazis picked up, right? And they borrowed from the racial fictions of the United States to invent an even more virulent strain of racism, casting Jews not as a religious group, but as a sort of biological group, right, as being different, right? Go ahead, Sid.
In the South, if you have one drop of Black blood, then you're Black.
Right.
Go find the Black blood in your.
Well, pretty much everybody who's white has some Black blood in us, right? Because we all came out of Africa, right? Just to point out, right, that for the Germans, they didn't like that idea, right? Because too many of the Germans who were making up these rules, right, had some Jewish ancestor way in the past. So basically, unless you, I forget what it was now, but I think it was basically the rule that we have now in Israel, right? That if you had one Jewish grandparent, you were Jewish beyond, you were beyond the pale, you were Jewish, right? Which of course, in our conception of Judaism today, right, it's a little complicated. Yeah, go ahead.
What I find kind of unnerving about all this is, I find it certainly unnerving, is even before this, if sociologically we have a need to be divisive, which seems to be the case going into people, therapists working with little kids. And if human beings have this need, is this always going to go on? Are we going to figure out how to work it out with one group and then it's just going to come up with another group because someone else feels secure? It's
a really great question, Nikki, right? Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering who the participants were when the scientists studied them. I mean, obviously, the characteristics, the biological characteristics of a Jewish person living in Argentina or way down South America, and a Jewish person living in Japan and another person living in England, they're going to have different biological characteristics. So who did they study?
Right. Right. I mean, that's a very good question, and probably a little bit above my pay grade. But what I can say is, because the cast talks about this, right, is that they decided that the most perfect skull came from the Caucasus, right? So they had the guy who came up with this idea of, like, you know, what was the master race? That's why white people are called Caucasians, right? Not because any of us came from the Caucasus, right? But because the skull that guy decided was really great, it was from the Caucasus. And so, you know, beautiful white people are Caucasian, and ugly and deformed Jews, right, are not from there, right? And in this country, right, lovely white people are white, right, and ugly and deformed, you know, people who are not white. I mean, it's a very sneaky, because racism very often points at things that are in fact sort of stereotypical traits of various groups, right? And so, you know, so you look at a person, if they have a stereotypical whatever it is, right, you can sort of assign them to that group. There was a satirical novel in Eastern Europe during right after the war, and I forget now who the author was or the rest of the plot, but I remember the initial incident, which is that the Nazis have taken over an Eastern European country, and they tell the local people to go take down all of the statues that depict Jews, right? And so they go, and they don't know how to do it because they don't know who's Jewish and who's not Jewish in this place, right? So what do they do? They take down the statue of the guy with the biggest nose. And who is the guy that they take down with the biggest nose? Wagner.
Oh.
As Mickey said, I mean, where is it going to end? I mean, even now with the Ukrainian thing, now there's big backlash in the U.S. Against Russians, the normal Russian people. A lot of
against the normal Russian people here in this country.
Yes, I mean,
it's
there was
interesting.
an article in the Globe the other day that Russian businesses, and I think I don't know whether it's this one down here, but people are not buying Russian goods, and they're very concerned.
Right, and that
the people who are
right,
purchasers are Ukrainian.
Right, and one of the crazy things about this particular conflict in Ukraine, right, is is that, there really is very little distinction, right, between Ukrainians and Russians, just to begin with, and then also in the context of the Soviet history, where the two countries were so intertwined, right? They were, and Ukrainians moved from Ukraine into Russia, Russians moved from Russia into Ukraine, right? And it would be like now saying that we were going to have a war with New York, right? And all the New Yorkers who were living up here, all the Yankees fans that were living up here, we were going to boycott them, right? And right, so you're in trouble, Judith. Right, and and vice versa, right? It's that, and on one hand, it's that crazy, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, right, the thing is that it's very, very difficult when you're dealing with governments, especially if you're dealing with a government that is erratic and run by this guy Putin, right? It's very difficult to figure out, well, how are you going to try to punish that government without punishing the people who are part of the country? And it's very hard. And so I don't know about here, like, is it, a lot of the Russian businesses I've heard about, have Ukrainians who work for them, so they're, and they're Americans, they're not Russians, right? So,
And bringing it closer to home, the division in this country between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, it's just the same. Democrats don't like Republicans, Republicans don't like Democrats. I mean, we're continuing. I feel,
Right.
I'm liberal, but I'm disgusted sometimes at my liberal friends, the way they talk about other people. They're good, they just have different ideas. So
well, I think that's a whole other discussion, and thank God it's not at the level of biological differences, although maybe we're getting there. Yeah, go ahead, Minnie.
This is a big detour.
Okay.
I keep thinking about something I don't know anything about, which is, so in biblical times, the tribes of Israel, how would they differentiate? What made one tribe one thing and another tribe another?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, and I do think, Mickey, right, that tribalism is a human characteristic, right? But I also think that it's also just a healthy characteristic, right? To be able to say, I'm Jewish and I'm not, and that person over there is Christian and is not Jewish, right? That there's which is not a I'm better and they're worse, right? It's just that this is my group and that's their group.
Concentration of energy, because they do things together.
Right, it's sort of concentric circles, in levels of how you're connected to the people around you, right? As soon as we're talking about people who live in Brookline, right, we're not talking about Jews versus Christians anymore. We're talking about people who live in Brookline as opposed to those crazy people who live in Newton, right? But I think the big thing here, for me at least, right, is that there's all different ways of distinguishing our group from other groups, right? But I think that where the difference is, right, comes right back to what Sid was saying at the beginning, right? If you're part of one group and you say, in Jewish terms, right, that I'm B'Tselem Elohim, right, I'm created in the image of God, and that person over there who's not in my group, right, but they are also equally B'Tselem Elohim, right, then all of the distinctions that we're making between our groups, right, are at some level superficial, right? And we're connected. Yeah, go ahead, Sid.
It reminds me of the joke of this guy was on a island all by himself.
That's right.
He built two synagogues. He says, we don't go to that one.
Right. We have the one I go to and the one I don't go to, right? It's very important to have a synagogue you don't go to. Right?
Oh,
Yeah.
a question over here. That's because.
Oh, go ahead, Isaac. That's because what?
It's only established people that think that way.
Oh, okay. It's only people who go to one synagogue. But a lot of people who don't go to any synagogues, well, I need two synagogues, says I need two synagogues I don't go to. Go ahead, Isaac.
Yeah, I was just thinking about in the context of the Russia-Ukraine
Yeah.
crisis that is ongoing. What's so interesting is that Putin has kind of inverted it, right? Is that he's making a claim that, quite as you say, Ukrainians are Russians, so we can take them.
Right.
Ukrainians are actually kind of making an argument that we're a different. They're creating precisely that sort of positive differentiation
Right.
talking about. And Volodymyr, I was listening to a podcast yesterday about, his name is not Vladimir Zelensky, but the president of Russia, of Ukraine. His name is Volodymyr Zelensky, as opposed to Vladimir Putin.
Right.
And by the way, he's also Jewish, right?
Right.
And he grew up speaking Russian, which is yet a third kind of complication.
100%.
So
right.
there is a kind of, they're doing a lot of work to create not a racial group of their own, but a different,
politically distinct, right? It's a politically distinct group, right?
The racial line,
right?
In some compelling ways, and
Exactly.
I think also speaks a little bit to your question about, well, which Jews' skulls were they measuring? Well, I think once upon a time in a less globalized world, they could point to a kind of a Jewish ethnic group in a way that's been dispersed.
Although, I mean, even in the 19th century, right, we had Jews all over the world, right? And Jews, as a general rule, right, love to talk about how we're separate from everybody else, but every Jewish group that's in a particular part of the world has a mysterious tendency to look just like the group where they live, right? So obviously they're not quite as distinct, right, as the lady doth protest a little too much in that regard, right? So they're always integrated to a certain extent. They're always integrated into the society where they're. All right. So let's get back to this. Applying the American color line to Europe, right? The Holocaust appears merely to be a form of sectarian violence. It's just the Christians versus the Jews, right? It's all white people. Right? And that seems, white people attacking white people, which is nonsensical. But those persecuting Jews in Europe, and I think this gets to your question, Judith, right? A very important question, right? Saw Jews as beastly subhumans, right? They saw them as not human. They saw them as a distinct, what we would call a distinct race, right? And if we begin to think about race, right, as a concept, and I'm just thinking of this now, so I don't want to stand too firmly on it, but it just occurs to me, right? If we're going to use that concept of race, right, and we're going to use it seriously to discriminate amongst people, right? Then, and I don't mean discrimination like legal disabilities. I'm saying we're going to make general discriminations among people based on their race, right? We are buying into the idea, right, that there are some races that are human and there are some races that are not human, right? That they are somehow less than human, right? So they, as beastly subhumans, an alien race, right? These Jews had come from, and we see these images all the time in Europe. We see them in America, right? These ghastly hordes coming from elsewhere. Right? Sometimes they're Jews, sometimes they're Mexicans, sometimes they're Syrians, right? The others coming in and ruining our nice civilization, right? And they were justified in destroying these subhumans in order to defend German racial purity, right? The Jews will not replace us, right? We heard in Charleston. The racial distinctions between master and slave may be more familiar to Americans, but they were and are no more real than those between Gentile and Jew. Adherence to religious belief, and this again gets to your question, Judith, right? A very important question, right? Adherence to religious belief was not required to be subject to Nazi persecution, nor is it required to be subject to anti-Semitism in this country, right? An anti-Semite doesn't necessarily care whether you go to shul or you don't go to shul. Right? Anti-Semites also now tend to go on the basis of appearance, right? And you can't always tell a Jew from a non-Jew. So they actually do go after probably more religious Jews because they have particular costumes, right? They wear a particular, yeah, go ahead.
What's the name of the person is another.
100%, right?
And this has been a fact problem with the African Americans using very unusual first names, which cause a problem and when they apply for a job.
Right, right. So people with black names, so identifiably black names, will not even get called back, right? In Ukraine, for instance, and Ukraine has really had a major shift in the way unfortunately the way black people are treated in Ukraine is not always so great, right? But the way Jewish people have been treated in Ukraine has really changed in the last 20 years. Right, but everybody in Ukraine knows if you're Jewish. How do they know? Because of your name, right? There are names Zelensky, right? You know, it's green, right? That Zelen is green, right? So it's, you know, so there are certain names in Ukrainian which are clearly Jewish names, even though his first name is Volodymyr, right? Which is an old Slavic name. Right.
It's pronounced the Ukrainian way as opposed to
Right,
Russian.
right. Not Vladimir, right, but Volodymyr, right? All right. All right, adherence, right, okay, so unlike some prior moments in European history, conversion was insufficient to escape danger. Jewish ancestry was enough because it was ancestry, a person's race, that made someone inescapably Jewish, right? And again, I mentioned that it was the 1/4 rule, right? In this country, it would be called a quadroon, right? It was only when you were a quadroon that you became a Jew, right? If you were less than a quarter Jewish, fine, you were Gentile, right? Whereas in this country, right, a single drop of blood made you a black person, even if you looked like all other white people. Okay. In his infamous memoir, Adolf Hitler regretted that early in life he'd seen anti-Semitism as persecution of a people based on religious belief, which he thought was wrong. He was against religious persecution, this man Hitler, right? But he later came to think of this as a Jewish lie, right? He was lied to by the Jews that this was religious persecution and thus unacceptable, right? It was a Jewish lie to hide the reality that the Jewish people were a separate race whose goal, right, was to enslave the rest of mankind, right? It should not be lost that enslaving all of mankind is a concise summary of Hitler's own political project, right? And also just to point out, right, that what does Putin like to say about the Ukrainians? Even the Jews who run Ukraine, right, that they are Nazis, right? Looking to do to him, right, what he's trying to do to them.
I believe his expression is drug-addled Nazis.
Oh, even better, even better. Let me finish this. I think, are we almost done? Oh, we're not quite done. So go ahead, Sid.
But Hitler said the Aryans are the highest rate, blue eye, but he didn't have blue eyes. He didn't have blonde hair. So where did he fit in?
It's a great question. It's a great question. And I think that the author of Caste mentions that and talks about it a little, but I can't remember exactly what she says. But it is always a mystery to me, you know, like he was not a great Aryan looking guy. Yeah. Jacob, do you have a sense of what that was?
There is
What,
such a thing as an Aryan.
there is, I mean, there's nothing, you know, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering whether are we going to spend any couple of minutes talking about the Whoopi Goldberg thing and how?
I would love to, but we've had such a rich conversation
Yeah.
that we're almost at time. So I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer and talk about it more, but I'm also aware that some people don't have the Sitzfleisch, the capacity to sit for more than an hour and talk about things like this. So with your permission, what I'll do is I think we'll talk. I'll bring let me read this article the rest of the way through. And then would there be interest in discussing this another time? Yeah, okay. So not next week. Next week is St. Patrick's Day and Purim on the same day, of course. So it's green beer for Purim this year. So on Wednesday, instead of this session, there's going to be St. Patrick's dinner. with corned beef and cabbage and probably some sort of vegetarian thing if you're not a corned beef eater. So we won't meet next week, so let's say the following week, we'll revisit this topic with the other article, the second article. Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, I got to scoot. Have a good rest of the day.
All right, so I'll just read this article now, right? I don't know how much is left. Judaism predates Western categories. It's not quite a religion because one can be Jewish regardless of observance or specific belief. My colleague Gary Rosenberg wrote, but it's also not quite a race because people can convert in, right? So if it were truly a race in the way that we often think about race, I could not be Jewish, right? You can't convert to being black, right? There was that woman, Rachel Dolezal, I think was her name, who tried to convert into being black and she was outed and, that just doesn't work. But, only the most bigoted left-wing Jews and the most bigoted right-wing Jews would tell me that I'm not Jewish, right? Either people who are completely Yiddishists, right? It's a racial category, and people who believe that Jews have a particular Yiddish neshama, right? A Yiddish soul that is inaccessible to people who weren't born of a Jewish mother. Okay, if I take away those two poles, right, everyone else in the middle is going to believe that I'm a Jew, right? There might be people who know me and say, not so much, but that's different. All right. It's not merely a culture or an ethnicity because that leaves out all the religious components. Right? This is all true, but Black Americans are not really a race either. And I think this is what's really important, right? First of all, just on the basis of it, right, there is no such thing as race, right? It's a fiction.
Right, which in my view makes such a ridiculous reaction. I know I just want to get my 2 cents in before.
Right.
So if there's no such thing as race, to have somebody be canceled from a show and such terrible things said about her,
Right, well, because I think the problem, and this is the problem that we run into again and again, right, with the distinction that I talked about with Kimberly Crenshaw, right, that race is a fiction,
Right.
but racism is real. So if you said, right, the Holocaust wasn't based on race, what she means is it's not based on racism.
then maybe we should use another word for race.
I think, well, maybe, I don't know, but we can
But
certainly,
it doesn't-
but anyway, but let me read this because I think this is relevant to what you're saying, right? Black Americans are not really a race either, and the borders of Black American identity can also be difficult to define or agree upon, right? Because it's very complicated, right? And one of the topics that came up in the book Cast, right, is that people who have come to this country, in the 20th century from places like the Caribbean or from Africa, right, find a need to differentiate themselves very strongly, very often, from African Americans whose people have been here for a lot longer, right? So are they Black or are they not Black, right? It's a very complicated question. To some extent, shared history, culture, and ancestry exist, but as the scholars Karen and Barbara Fields write in Racecraft, the very concept of race implies a material reality where none exists. And I think that's really important to remember, that whenever we start talking about race,
Right.
we're talking about something that doesn't really exist, right? It exists only in people's minds. And I don't know exactly what to do with that, right? Because, that's also true of religion in a sense, right? Obviously religion is true in as much as it's important for people, right? But it's ideology, right? It's, the empirical truth of religion is hard to determine, right? Most American descendants of the emancipated enslaved people have white ancestry, and millions of white Americans with African ancestry have no knowledge of it, right? What we were saying before. Race is not an idea, but an ideology. It came into existence at a discernible historical moment for rationally understandable historical reasons, right? The Fields that's the people who wrote Racecraft, and is subject to change for similar reasons, right? So it's constantly morphing. It is not necessary for race to be real, for racism to be real. It is only necessary that people believe that race is real. When people act on fictions, those actions have repercussions, even if the underlying belief is false, even if the people know that the underlying belief they are acting on is false. The fact that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish control of the media, of governments, and of financial institutions are untrue does not rob them of their explanatory power for those who choose to believe in them. For Thomas Jefferson to know somewhere in the disquiet of his own conscience that slavery was a cruel war against human nature itself, did not in and of itself grant freedom to those he owned as property. The people who settled this country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't, you can tell, they knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role of this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man.
Is
100%. Thank you, Minnie. Right, that this is the way people talked about people, right, until third wave feminism, and so we always need to translate, right? But we can't necessarily change people's words, but we do need to translate, right? Baldwin here is talking about people, but he's using the masculine, which always leads to the potential confusion that what he actually means is men. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to try to mute here. Okay, there we go. James Baldwin wrote in 1964, "For if he wasn't a man, then no crime had been committed." Right? And I think this is the fatal appeal, right, of this idea of race, right? We can put them in a different category that's not human, right? And that allows us to do to those people what we would never dream of doing to someone who is in the category of human. To this, we could add John Paul Sartre's observation that if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. Race allows humanity to keep inventing in language that can bend the most rational minds, groups of people whose supposed characteristics justify whatever cruelty we might wish to imagine. All right, so we sort of end where Mickey is worried, right? Where we end on Mickey. That's one of the reasons I brought the other article, because this one ended on such a terrible note. But we'll have to live, right, with this tension, right? But yes, that there is this sort of human need to invent the other, right? And there's always the possibility that people will, in inventing the other, right, make that other less than human. And we need to, everyone else, right, needs to constantly work against that. Go ahead, Sid.
What did we call the Japanese during the war?
Right.
Gooks.
Right. Gooks. Right. And didn't we call the people in Vietnam that also? Yeah. So right, and that's one of the major dangers, right, of the current war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Right, is we see this. I see it now among some of the Russian commentators, right, of sort of denying sort of the status of fully independent nation to Ukraine, which is one sort of thing like, well, they're actually not really people, right? And the Ukrainians so far, again, our media is so favorable to the Ukrainians. I'm sure we're not hearing all the things that the Ukrainians are doing. But what we do hear, right, is the Ukrainians sort of calling out to the Russians and saying, why are you fighting? Go away, break your tank.
You don't listen to Fox News.
I don't listen to Fox News. No, I don't. I tried I actually just stopped listening to the news.
I want to get an ulcer to this, what Fox News.
I would like to stay alive a little bit. If I started watching Fox News, I would have a heart attack tomorrow. So it's not worth it to me.
I was just thinking that, if we're all talking about race and it's really a non-existing entity. I think when I write now, I'm going to when I use the word race, I'm going to put it in quotes.
I think there might be really something to that, right? That that there are certain categories. I mean, but my problem with this, right, is that it does feel to me as though all of the sort of ways that we distinguish ourselves from other people, all the ways that we distinguish the groups we're in from the other groups we're in, right? They are all at some level fictions, right? Some of them are productive fictions, right? And many of them are unproductive or even, detrimental. And so it's a matter of, so I don't know where race falls in with all the other ones, right?
Yeah.
So but Mimi, you want to say something?
I'm gonna skip what I have to say for that, and I'll do my predictable, how valuable Buddhism has been for me with it's not an idea, the belief of non-separation.
Right. Although I just have to point out, right, that the kind of Buddhism that we get to engage in here in this country is very different than the kind of Buddhism that exists in, say, in Myanmar, right, where the Buddhists, right, are oppressing the Muslims, right, and in ways that we generally would find. And so yes, I think that there is great, I do think, right, and there's a great tradition of non-dualism in Judaism that predates Jubu, right? And I think it's one of the reasons why there are so many Jubus is because there was this sort of very strong tradition of non-dualism in Judaism to begin with, right? And so when it encountered Buddhism in specifically in the American scene, right, it was like, oh, this makes sense, right? And so, but yes, I actually do believe, right, that whether Jewish or Buddhist, that this concept of non-dualism really helps, right?
Non-what?
Non-dualism, right? That there is only one, right? And in Jewish terms, right, we say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right? God is one, right? In a sense that God is all, right? And there are no real distinctions. All distinctions, right, are sort of in a sort of what we would call, they would say that in a sort of more quotidian reality, right? In the true reality, right? There's no distinctions. How would you describe it in Buddhism, Minnie? Is it similar to that?
I define Israel as God is separate from me.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because I think that's one of the important things about non-dualism in Judaism, right? Is God is literally all.
Right.
And there, and obviously in Judaism, right, we address God as a separate entity, right? So it's not even that is not total.
Right.
Yeah, Judaism is a very non-totalizing experience. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody, for sticking in. I'm sorry I was late. I just didn't want to cancel this session, so that's why I ended up deciding to make it a little later, and I'm sorry it was even later than I thought. So.
We had a wonderful discussion.
Well, I know. I mean, from now on, I'm just going to say maybe I just won't show up at all, and Jacob will be here. So.
Well, at least every other week.
Yeah. All right. So just a reminder on Monday afternoon next week. Jacob and I don't know about the dogs and Julia, we will be at Cohen for a Purim party. So there will not be Jewish learning here on Monday, but we will be here on Thursday afternoon for a Purim party on the day of Purim. So here in this building. So wear your costumes, right? Come ready to drink until you can't see straight, right? I can't promise I'm going to find green beer, but if I can, it's St. Patrick's Day.
On all the announcement sheets?
Yes, it'll be right.
It's difficult to.
It's difficult to keep track. I tell you, it's difficult. It's difficult for me to keep track. So yes.
Well, we're glad you do.
But all right, thank you, everybody.
You'll put up a notice, right?
What?
You'll put up a notice.
Yes.
the other thing, as I'm sure you can predict me saying, I think there is real difference between straight and gay. I think that's real.
Oh, yeah.
So-
Yeah, well, those are biological differences, right?
No, that's a preference. It's not a.
Interesting.
That's not.
You don't,
biological.
because it's interesting because there's,
I don't think, no.
because there's, I remember going to a, a conference, and they were talking about sort of
Thank you. It
the
was very
biological
interesting.
basis of these things. I'm sorry?
Men tend to think that way.
Oh, interesting. And I don't remember, of course, I think just to make it even more complicated, I think the person giving the presentation was a trans woman. So-
Thank you. It was really.
Thank you. So, but yeah, no, I mean, I think it's so interesting because I notice there are certain realities, right, that, and maybe it, because, that, like, there are certain things that you can observe about particular groups of people, right? And those stereotypes, could actually, often be true.
Right,
Right. So like, for instance, I was thinking about this one today. I have a friend who lives in Texas, and she came and did a few programs with me. And I asked her, how did she want me to put her bio? And she was saying, oh, we Black people, we like to have our titles everywhere. Put our titles everywhere.
right,
And ever since she said that, I've
Yeah.
noticed
right.
that by and large, right, people who have privilege like I do, like, I don't care if you use
Right.
my title.
Or Joe Biden.
Right, who cares? I'm a white guy, right?
Yeah.
You go ahead and disrespect me, I don't care. But, but for a lot of other people, like, no, use my title.
Yeah.
Right?
I worked hard to get it.
Right, exactly. I did all this stuff and
Yeah.
you're gonna respect me for it,
Yeah.
and I'm like, hey, but that's not biological, right? That's cultural.
No.
That's
no.
cultural. But it's real. And I think that's what it's,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's real for the people for whom it's real. And
Yes.
right. And
Right.
so I just think it's real. But yes, I agree with you. I do think that,
I mean, yeah.
but I don't know, but it's also interesting because, seeing my kid he's Jacob's age, right? And his friends at college, the degree to which there's so much flexibility gender wise. I mean, it's amazing to see, like, everyone
Oh,
is just, they
wonderful.
feel so free to be just who they are
Absolutely.
in a way that was really fraught when I
Right.
was in college, and
It's
must
the
have been
only-
that much worse when you were
Only time
young.
I'll use the word hope. is
Right.
When I think of
Right.
that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, it's amazing. It's wonderful to see. So,
Okay.
all right,
thank
sounds
you.
good, Mindy. Thank you. Thank you, Francine. Thank you, Florence. See you soon.